What's up everybody, welcome to Moto. Today we're going to start reassembling the front end and putting the forks back on the bike. So let's check it out.
Zaidi, Zaidi. Zaidi,
Okay, so here we have the right side fork, and we're going to start by inserting it through the triple trees and then threading everything else that needs to be on it. So first bottom, triple tree, okay, then the clip-ons, and then the top triple tree. And for now we're just gonna clamp it on just past the initial thread, or past the initial little groove on it, just so we can line things up. And this time I'm just going to lightly tighten the triple tree clamps before just so I can keep things in place, but the full tightening will be done afterwards. And we're going to be using the triple tree clamps as essentially vices so that we can tighten the forks on top and the bottom. Okay, so this one is in. Let's get the other one in, and then we're going to tighten the tops. I got both fork tubes in. They're obviously not aligned right now, so they're kind of skewed. But that's not what we're looking for. I just needed them to be clamped in so I can tighten the tops. These caps on the V45 Sabre should be tightened to 15 to 30 Newton meters or 11 to 22 foot-pounds of torque. So I have my torque wrench set up to 20 foot-pounds, and we're just going to tighten these. Let's see if we can do that. That's it, they're tightened. Let's put the caps back on and move on with the rest of the installation. So next part of the installation, so that we have everything lined up properly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move the forks down so that that groove that we see here is perfectly lined up with the top of the triple tree clamps, so that we know that the top of the forks are at the same height. Then we're going to temporarily install the front wheel and the front axle so that we know the bottoms are set up properly, and that's when we're going to install the fork brace and tighten it so that everything's lined up, and then we're going to go ahead and take the front wheel off again, install the brake calipers, the Fender, and we're going to put the front wheel back on, set up the right side caliper, and tighten everything back to spec, and the front end should be okay. Now, the one thing to mention here is I still haven't received the extra dust seal for this side, so this won't be the final setup for this installation. Once I have that, that's when I'll need to pull off the front wheel again and set this up. But for the time being, we'll just set things up, and maybe we'll drop the bike down just so we can measure the fork height or fork length, so that we can play around with the geometry simulation a bit further before doing our final configuration. So let's get the front wheel back on, so that we can, and the forks drop down so that we can set everything up and line it up properly. Alright, front wheel is on, just temporarily. I put in the axle, tightened it by hand just a little bit, put in this axle mounting bracket on the right side, just so it's aligned on the left and on the right at the same height. The forks on top are all lined up with that thing, so now the forks are actually lined up. Or you can see the actuation, nice and smooth. So let's put in the top bracket. so we can tighten that and ensure that the forks are essentially mounted at the same height. And then once we have that in place, bracing it together, we're gonna take off the front wheel again and start reinstalling the brakes. So let's do that. Okay, front wheel is off again. Now let's install the left side caliper. We've also tightened, again, just by hand, the fork brace, just so we keep things leveled. Once I get the final components for here, I'll probably have to take off the wheel again and then realign things again. So this for now will just be temporarily on there, not fully tightened. Same with the fork position in terms of the offset on the triple trees. Just for now, we're just kind of mounting things just to free up space in the workshop, but also to make sure that we haven't broken something. So let's install this guy. This guy, as we saw before, is just held by the big bolt at the top, which fits into here and essentially pivots on this, and then the bottom bolt down here, this guy, which just goes through there. I will need the ability to pivot this in order to install that dust seal. So for now it's just test fitting pretty much. So let's get that on there. And then we'll put on the fender, which will act as another kind of support piece here. And then we can put the front wheel back on, then the left side or the right side caliper, tighten things back up, and then we're going to tighten up the the clip-ons so that we can drop the bike down and maneuver it around. And we're going to measure the sag on the forks again without any pressure in there, as well as at full 14 psi. So first things first, let's get this guy installed back on there. Brake caliper is on. Right now the two bolts, I'm just tightening them by hand, not to a precise setting and not too tight, so I can take them off. As you can see, there's a big hole here. That's because I don't have that dust seal. We will need to disassemble this again to put the seal back on there when it does arrive. But for now, this should be fine because we're not going to actually ride the bike anywhere. We're just going to do a test fitting. Okay, so that's in. Let's get the fender on and put the front wheel back on there. All right, the fender and the front wheel are on. A few tips on getting them in there. The front wheel will touch these areas here, so you'll need to like wiggle it in, and as you're wiggling it in, you'll also need to align the left side rotor with the brake pads and the brake caliper. To make your life easier, once you get the wheel past the mounting point, just push on here. That will shift the entire caliper off to that side, free up the space, and allow you to kind of line things up. Now when you're putting the axle back in, there is a big bushing right here. It's very easy to knock this bushing off, especially when you're wiggling things in place. So if it falls out and you put the thing in, the axle will just continue screwing in, and you can literally like pull it out the other side. So make sure you have that in place so that everything can actually be tightened and installed properly. Okay, now that we have this in place, let's hook up the speedometer sensor and the right side brake caliper, and then we're gonna move our attention back to the top to set up the clip-ons, and then maybe we're gonna take off the bike from the jack stands and start to measure things. So let's get that done. All right, speed sensor is installed. Something to mention here is that the little driver pin, edge, whatever you want to call it, is kind of like a flathead screwdriver.
it needs to align with the socket that's in there, so it might take a little bit of wiggling around and turning it to line things up so you can push things all the way in and then screw in the bolt. On the other side, pretty much same idea as the left side caliper. Just make sure it's spread out as much as possible. Remove the bolts from it, slide it onto the disc, line it up, screw the bolts in. Right now I've just kind of like hand tightened them just so they're not dangling around and moving all over the place. So we can just test measure things. So let's take a look at the front, the clip-ons. Let's move them up and tighten them somewhere in the middle so we still have room to move the forks up and down. But enough so that they're actually handlebars that we can steer the motorcycle with. And then we're going to drop the bike. So let's do that. All right, everything's set up. The handlebars are tightened so they don't fold in. Right now they're kind of in a ridiculous full width position, but that's okay. Like, that's not their final position anyways. So let's drop the bike and measure things out. All right, well, this is the bike with no air in the forks. Let's measure out the sag on that. All right, so that looks like significantly less than before with no air. So we're looking at, yeah, right around 2 centimeters. Before we were like up to 2 inches. So like right about where my thumb is. So that's great. Significantly less sag without even pressurizing the forks. So now let's pressurize them to 14 PSI and see what happens. All right, now the forks are pumped up to 14 PSI. Let's check that out. Doesn't look like there's much of a change. Yeah, we're actually slightly less than 2 centimeters now. I'm looking at 1.8 centimeters. So about 2 centimeters of sag pretty much at all times, which is great. Pretty consistent. I mean, that's your progressive springs, right? Okay, let's measure the fork length now. And we should be wrapping up. All right, so after measuring the fork length at rest of the bike, we're looking at 77 centimeters or 770 millimeters, which is 12 millimeters shorter than the stock bike, which is very interesting because on the table we measured about 1.5. The springs were about 1 inch shorter, but it seems like the overall length has been shortened significantly. So that's 12 centimeters. So it looks like my best option might actually be to move the forks all the way down to here instead of pulling them further up in order to make things even out a little better. Either way, that still remains to be figured out because the bike is still not fully tightened in place and everything is not yet fully configured. But that is very interesting. It will certainly set up the bike for a very different stance
All right, guys, that was it for this episode. The forks are back on the bike. We had some interesting discoveries with the new fork length, about 12 centimeter difference, which we'll see how that plays out into our geometry simulation, just so we can better adjust the overall setup of the bike so that it's still safe. So make sure to subscribe, hit the little bell for notifications when new videos become available. Check me out on Instagram at balconmoto2018, and make sure to check out balconmoto.com, where I have articles and different tools that you can use for your own builds. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.